Hi, my name's Shaylin and I'm a chemistry major at Carnegie Mellon University, and I am so excited to be working with the Leonard Gelfand Center to bring you this virtual module. Being a chemist, I've spent a lot of time in the lab mixing together different chemicals to try to make different reactions happen. I'm very used to measuring out specific, exact amounts of reactants and putting them in very specific temperatures and environments so that I get a specific product that I want. While working in a lab like this might seem impressive, nature is actually a far more precise and extraordinary example of chemistry at work. If we were to look closely, we would realize that nature is just a series of very complex reactions that allow organisms to transfer energy to each other so that they can survive. In this module, we are going to learn about Earth's biosphere and what the circle of life really means. Earth is made up of 4 different spheres. The first one is called the lithosphere. The lithosphere includes layers of Earth, including the mantle and the crust.
In this picture, you can see the layers of the Earth, going all the way down to the very hot core. The lithosphere is made up of the topmost layers of the Earth, including the crust and the upper mantle.
The second sphere is the hydrosphere, which is made up of all of the water on Earth in gas, liquid, and solid form.
This includes the solid water in ice caps, liquid water in oceans, and even water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere.
The third sphere is the atmosphere, which contains all of the air in and surrounding planet Earth. The air in Earth's atmosphere is responsible for winds, weather patterns, and absorbing light from the sun. The fourth sphere, and the one that we'll be talking about today, is the biosphere, which includes all living things on planet Earth. This includes plants, animals, fungi, and even very small microorganisms like bacteria. A microorganism is just a living thing that you can't see with the naked eye. You would need to hold it underneath of a microscope in order to see it. The biosphere, which is huge, can be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. We can go from biosphere to biome, to ecosystem, to community, to population, and to individual. Don't worry, we're going to break down all of those terms in just a second. If we move one level below the biosphere, we have biomes. Biomes are regions with very specific temperatures, climates, and locations. 2 examples of biomes are tropical rainforests and the Arctic tundra. Below biomes, we have ecosystems. An ecosystem is the combination of living and non-living things in an area. An example of an ecosystem could be a lake.
The ecosystem would include all animals and plants that live in or by the lake, such as fish, tadpoles, and pondweeds. It would also include the water, rocks, and soil found in the lake.
The living things in an ecosystem are called biotic factors, while the non-living things in an ecosystem, like water or rocks, are called abiotic factors. A community is made up of different living organisms that live in the same place at the same time. So it's kind of like you just took the biotic factors out of an ecosystem. A community within the lake ecosystem could include frogs, algae, plants, and fish that all live in the lake. A population is a group of one type of species that lives in an area. At a lake, you have a population of frogs and a population of dragonflies, for example. An individual is a single organism or living being. One frog that lives by the lake would be an individual. All of these levels are really useful for scientists when they're trying to describe food chains or do other sorts of ecological research. Ecology is the study of the relationship between organisms and their environments. To review the different levels of organization, complete the Organizing Organisms worksheet. You will be asked to categorize a list of terms into different levels of organization, including biosphere, biome, ecosystem, community, population, and individual. Pause the video and complete the worksheet before we move on to the next section of the module.
Let's go over the answers for the Organizing Organisms worksheet to see if your answers matched mine. So we already defined a biosphere as all living things on Earth. So that's the only thing that I had in that category. We already know that biomes can be large geographic areas that have one type of temperature or weather or climate. So in this category, we have desert, the African savanna, and a temperate forest. We know that an ecosystem exists in an area that has biotic or living and abiotic or non-living factor. Examples of ecosystems in the list provided were a stream with stones, clay, fish, bugs, and algae, and a beach with seagulls, crabs, shells, and sand. I put these items in the ecosystem category instead of the community category because they also consisted of non-living things like stones, clay, and shells. This leads to the community category, where we'll see different types of organisms that are all living. Here I put squirrels, bugs, and birds that live in an oak tree, and the different kinds of fish in an aquarium tank. Next, we move on to population, which will contain many organisms of the same species. Two examples of population are the apple trees in an orchard and a hive of bees. Lastly, an organism is anything that is an individual living being. This includes a single bacteria cell, a house cat, caterpillar, and one piece of mold growing on old bread.
Now that you've learned a little bit more about the classifications and different levels in ecology, let's look further into some of the roles that different organisms play. In order for any organism to live, it must have a way of creating energy. Humans create energy when they eat food, which contains a molecule called glucose. The body converts these glucose molecules into energy through a process called cellular respiration. The energy produced from this process allows us to function. It allows our hearts to beat, our lungs to breathe, and our brains to fire tons of signals to the rest of our bodies. Any organism that must consume food in order to create energy is called a consumer. Animals are great examples of consumers. Plants have a different way of making energy. They're able to create their own food or their own glucose molecules by using energy from the sun. The process of using light energy to make glucose molecules is called photosynthesis. Since plants can make their own food using photosynthesis, they don't have to consume other organisms in order to get energy. They simply go through the photosynthetic process to create glucose and then go through a cellular respiration process to convert that glucose into energy. Plants need energy to grow and survive just like animals do. Any organism that is able to create its own food to use as energy is called a producer. Plants are great examples of producers. A third and very, very important role in an ecosystem is the role of a decomposer. A decomposer is a specific type of consumer that will only eat dead tissues and waste in an ecosystem. Decomposers are able to break down the last bits of nutrients and energy in dead tissue and release it back into the water, soil, and air in an ecosystem. Some examples of decomposers are worms, mushroom or fungi, and bacteria. Each of these three types of organisms, consumers, producers, and decomposers, transfer energy to each other and make a sustainable ecosystem possible. Sustainability is another word for exchanging resources so that you never run out of them.
This picture shows an example of a simple sustainable ecosystem. Let's break it down. First, the sun gives off light, which is converted to food and energy by grass, a producer. A consumer like a cow will come along and eat the grass, gaining energy from it. When the cow dies, decomposers will get energy by breaking down the cow's tissues. During this process, the decomposers release nutrients into the soil. These nutrients can be reused by the grass in order to grow even more. This cycle continues on, allowing for a continuous flow of energy throughout the ecosystem.
This cycle of different organisms being able to transfer energy and nutrients to one another is one of the reasons why ecosystems on planet Earth have been able to survive for so long. Here's a self-sustaining ecosystem that I made. using items from my backyard. It's self-sustaining because it only needs energy from the sun to survive. So how does energy flow in this ecosystem?
Similar to the last example we looked at, the producers in the jar, which are clover and moss plants, will absorb sunlight, converting it into food and energy to grow. Soil naturally contains bacteria and other microorganisms that are decomposers. When any part of one of the plants dies, the decomposers in the soil will break it down. This way, the decomposers gain energy to survive while releasing nutrients into the soil that help the plants grow even more. As long as the ecosystem has sunlight and a little bit of water, it will be able to sustain itself and stay alive.
If you're interested in making your own self-sustaining ecosystem, pause the video here and follow the instructions on the Biosphere in a Jar handout.
Now that we've learned about producers, consumers, and decomposers, we can start to look more closely at different types of consumers and construct ecological pyramids. Primary consumers are consumers at the bottom of the food chain that eat plants to survive. They're usually herbivores like mice, bugs, and rabbits. If we go up one level on the food chain, we will find secondary consumers. Secondary consumers might eat plants, but they also eat primary consumers. An example of a secondary consumer could be a fox or a crow. Moving up yet another level, we have tertiary consumers. As you might have guessed, tertiary consumers will eat secondary consumers in order to survive. You can keep going up to higher levels of consumers. At the very top of the food chain are apex predators. These consumers do not have any natural predators, which means that they don't have any other non-human organism that will hunt and eat them. It's important to note, though, that an apex predator could be consumed by a decomposer, but only after it has died. A mountain lion is an example of an apex predator.
Each of these organisms, be it producers, primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers, occupies a trophic level. A trophic level is a level on a food chain that contains organisms that have very similar feeding behaviors. For example, mice and rabbits are often grouped together in the same trophic level because they both are primary consumers and both eat plants to get their energy.
As you can see, if we look at the size of each trophic level, we've started to form a pyramid shape. This structure is called an ecological pyramid, and it represents the food chain and flow of energy in an ecosystem.
The largest populations and greatest amount of energy are found at the bottom of ecological pyramids, with plants. There is so much energy at the bottom level because there are so many plants that all are creating their own energy daily. As you move up the pyramid to higher trophic levels, you'll notice that populations get smaller, and therefore there is less energy at that level of the ecological pyramid. An ecological pyramid also represents the food chain within an ecosystem, since higher level organisms consume lower level organisms. In this next activity, I want to challenge you to go outside and build an ecological pyramid based off of an ecosystem that you find near you. To get started on this activity, take out the Building an Ecological Pyramid worksheet. When you're searching for an ecosystem around you, remember that you can find ecosystems anywhere, by a pond or a lake, in a forest, or even in your own backyard. A good place to start looking is to find somewhere with plants, since plants are the base of any ecosystem.
I'll walk through what I did for the Building an Ecological Pyramid worksheet. It won't be exactly the same as yours, but I think it should lead you in the right direction and give you an understanding of what we're looking for in this assignment. It can also show you how you can view organisms in your own backyard as an ecosystem. So in my pyramid, I chose to represent the ecosystem around my house. I live on the other side of Pennsylvania, near New Hope, which is a very foresty area. There's a lot of trees everywhere, and I tried to base it off of the animals that I have seen around in my yard. The producers on my pyramid consisted of plants that I actually have in my yard, like ash trees, Japanese maple trees, and yellow lilies. I tried to think of what animals I've seen snacking on the plants in my yard, and so for my primary consumers, I came up with groundhogs, which my dad is always trying to fend off every summer once the lilies bloom, because they will come right up and eat the entire bulb off the top. I've also seen mice, and I've seen a lot of deer around my yard. Actually, there's a little group of deer that hang out in my backyard. We see each season when they have babies, so there's little baby fawns walking around. It's really cool. Next, I tried to think of what animals could eat the primary consumers. First, I came up with foxes. In the nighttime, we can hear foxes wandering around my house. They're very scary when they scream. They've got a really creepy noise that they make. So I know for a fact that foxes are eating some of the mice and groundhogs around. And I also had to throw in here a picture of my cat because because each of my cats have been able to catch mice that live around my house, and they never fail to bring those mice up to the door and present us with how great they've done at catching some prey. And then at the top of the pyramid, I thought of coyotes, which I've never actually seen a coyote in my area, but I do know that they live there because of some research that I've done about different types of organisms that live in foresty areas like by my house. When I was looking at question 2 and asked myself if the organisms at the top of my pyramid were apex predators, I actually said no. After doing some research, I learned that coyotes do have some natural predators like bears and mountain lions, which I know also exist in very forested areas. For question 3, I did not include any decomposers on my pyramid, but I can definitely think of some that I've seen around. I've seen some mushrooms that grow under trees in my yard, and I've definitely seen worms in the soil, which I know break down dead tissues of plants and animals and are able to retrieve the extra nutrients from these tissues and release them back into the soil.
An ecological pyramid is a great example of how important balance is in an ecosystem. Picture an actual physical pyramid in your head. If the top of the pyramid were too large, then the foundation would not be able to fully support it and there would be a chance of it falling off. The same thing could happen if the bottom of the pyramid were really, really small, attempting to balance large layers on top of it. To translate those ideas into ecological phenomena, we can think about the rising and falling of population sizes. We already know that the top layer of an ecological pyramid represents the population of the top predators in the ecosystem. If there are too many predators, then they will be competing for food or energy that they get from the bottom parts of the pyramid. Especially if these predators are carnivores and only eat organisms from the trophic level below them, there will not be enough food to sustain such a large amount of predators. Therefore, many predators would die off and we would see a decrease in their population size. Since ecosystems are so delicately balanced, even a small change can cause a massive shift in population sizes. For example, waste that humans introduce into the ground because of garbage or chemicals can lead to an imbalance of nutrients in the soil. Without proper nutrients, plants are not able to survive, which leads to less food for the primary consumers. If primary consumers cannot eat, they will die, causing their population to shrink. However, if the primary consumer's population shrinks, so will the secondary consumer's population. This is because the secondary consumers rely on the primary consumers as their food source. This shrinking effect travels all the way up an ecological pyramid and can even affect the top apex predators. In extreme cases, it can cause extinction of the predators at the top of a food chain. That being said, you can imagine the shock to an ecosystem if a trophic level in the pyramid is either inserted or completely removed. This is precisely what happened in Yellowstone National Park. Take out the worksheet called A Case Study, the Yellowstone Ecosystem, to learn more about this event. Follow the instructions on the worksheet to learn more about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park in 1995. Then answer some questions to test your understanding. Pause the video here to get started.
Let's go over the answers to the case study, the Yellowstone ecosystem worksheet, before we wrap everything up. For question number 1, we had to summarize why it was important to bring wolves back into the Yellowstone ecosystem. Well, scientists realized that the ecosystem without wolves was very imbalanced. Without wolves, the elk population was rising exponentially, and they were eating a lot of the vegetation that other herbivores in the area, like bison and beavers, relied on to survive. As a result, the populations of those other herbivores decreased, and the elk population continued to grow unchecked, which could spell trouble for the survival of some other organisms in the area. For the second question, we were asked to analyze this graph, which shows population data for both elk and wolves in Yellowstone National Park over the course of about 4 decades. 2A asks us what describes the decrease in the elk population starting in 1955. From the video, we learned that 1955 was the year that wolves were reintroduced into the Yellowstone ecosystem. So the elk population decreased as these wolves were able to hunt and prey on the elk. Question 2B asks us to look at each y-axis on the population graph. Why is the wolf population so much smaller than the elk population? Actually, if we look at the graphs to the side, we can see that the wolf population is going by 20s, while the elk population is actually these little increments of 5,000s. The wolf population is so much smaller because the further away you get from the bottom of the food chain, the less energy is available to support larger populations. This is why in any food chain you will have a much larger amount of plants than apex predators. Because as organisms go to consume one another, there's always going to be some energy that is wasted and lost. So there's no way that we'll be able to preserve all the energy from the bottom of the pyramid going all the way up. So that's why the wolf population is so much smaller. Question 2C asks us to think about a graph of the willow population and what that would look like from 1955 to present day. Would the population be increasing or decreasing? So if we recall from the video, elk and other herbivores fed on the willow population. We could guess that a graph of the willow population would show an increase starting from 1995. This is because as the elk population shrank, there would be less willows being consumed and possibly killed by elk. If we think about the y-axis of this graph, the willow populations would be a lot larger than the elk populations at any given point because organisms at the bottom of the food chain have the most energy to sustain large populations. Lastly, for question number 3, we were introduced to the concept of a food web, where we can see the flow of energy and what organisms eat one another. I made one based off of some of the organisms that we learned about in the video, which I'll show here. In order to make my food web, I did some online research, and I actually found this helpful link from the National Park Service, which told me all about the ecosystem in Yellowstone National Park and which animals are predators or prey to one another. If we look at the bottom of the web, we start off with our producers, including grass, gray willows, and aspen. From my nifty little National Park Service handout, I learned that grass is consumed by bison and elk, so I drew arrows from the grass to the bison and from the grass to the elk. I did something similar with the willows, which are consumed by elk and beavers, and the aspen, which are consumed by elk and beavers as well. Bison, elk, and beavers are all consumed by wolves, so I have arrows pointing from each of these creatures up towards their predator, the wolf. And grizzly bears eat a lot of things actually, 2 of which are grass and elk, so I drew arrows moving up. It's interesting to look at how grizzly bears, who are apex predators and live at the top of the ecological pyramid, not only eat consumers from levels below them, but also eat producers. In order to be an apex predator, you don't have to be a carnivore, right? There are plenty of omnivores like grizzly bears that eat plants and animals, but still have no natural predators and are at the top of the food chain.
Hopefully you have a better idea of how delicately balanced ecosystems are after completing that activity. Now that we're coming to the end of the module, let's take some time to review all of the concepts that we covered today.
First, we looked at the 4 different spheres of Earth, including the rocky lithosphere, the water-based hydrosphere, the gaseous atmosphere, and the biosphere, which contains all living things on planet Earth. We saw that a biosphere could be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. Smaller than the biosphere is a biome, like a tropical rainforest or Arctic tundra. Smaller than a biome is an ecosystem, which consists of biotic or living and abiotic or non living factors. Smaller than an ecosystem is a community, which just contains the biotic factors of an ecosystem. Smaller than a community is a population of one species. Smaller than a population is a single organism called an individual. Next, we talked about the different roles that organisms play in an ecosystem. Consumers are organisms that eat other organisms to survive. They turn glucose into energy through a process called cellular respiration. Animals are examples of consumers. Producers are organisms that can produce their own food and energy from sunlight. They do this by using photosynthesis to make food, followed by cellular respiration to make energy. Plants are examples of producers. Decomposers are a special type of consumer that break down dead tissue. Bacteria are examples of decomposers. We saw various examples of how consumers, producers, and decomposers work together to sustainably exchange resources. We also looked at different levels of consumers. Primary consumers eat producers, while secondary consumers eat primary consumers, tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and so on. If we group these consumers into trophic levels based on their eating habits, we create an ecological pyramid, which represents the food chain and the flow of energy in an ecosystem. At the top of any ecological pyramid, we have apex predators, which have no natural predators that hunt and consume them. Lastly, we looked at how sensitive an ecological pyramid is and how changes in population size can disrupt the balance of an ecosystem, sometimes causing extinction. We did a case study on the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone to see a real-world example of how maintaining a balanced ecosystem is essential for survival on planet Earth.
Did you know that the cycling of energy is actually a huge topic of research in energy science? Scientists are looking into ways that we can mimic the photosynthetic process in plants in renewable energy sources like solar cells. Scientists really want to figure out, is there another way that we can capture energy from the sun? Scientists are also asking if there's a way that we can use the biomass or organisms found in an ecosystem as fuel instead of using fossil fuels, which can release toxic chemicals into the environment and are also a major factor in climate change. If you'd like to learn more about renewable energy, leave a comment at the bottom of this video and maybe we can make another module all about that topic. We also have so many other modules on our website
If you visit this link,
there you can find a lot of other videos in topics such as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope that you enjoyed the module. My name is Shaylin, and I'll see you next time.